I'm going to assume we're on, everybody. It is 7:30. I can't tell by the light because it seems to be going a little crazy. But there it is. All right, 7:30. Welcome to the Finance Committee meeting, February 13, 2019. Tonight's meeting is televised, and we will jump right into the agenda. To start off, we have Connor Reed here to go through the 2018 Summary Report of Financial Condition and Discussion. So, Connor, if you'd like to step up to the mic and share with us what you got. Everybody has a handout that Connor provided, correct?
Correct.
Okay, I have an extra one if needed. Craig, do you want?
May I have one? Because
Yes.
I was planning on the budget first, so.
So prepared.
Thank you.
Extra. Oh, we had multiples.
No, Mark, I don't know. I provided a PowerPoint on this to the selectmen. Was that something the finance committee was expecting, or do you want to just? Did you have questions about a report? How would you like to go through?
Repeat my options again.
There is a PowerPoint that I provided to the selectmen, and I believe the budget subcommittee on this. It was circulated a few weeks back. We could go through that, although I do have a budget presentation, so I don't want to take up your entire night. We can just talk through it.
I think if we just give some highlights on
Sure.
the 2018 report, that would be fine. And
Sure.
thank you for sharing the slides. Those were distributed to the committee, so, and everyone was asked to take an opportunity to review that and or to watch the Board of Selectmen meeting during which that report was presented. Jen and I had the good fortune of being at the Board of Selectmen meeting when we heard that presentation, so thank you for that.
Sure. Great.
But it would be helpful if this group just gets some highlights.
Great. So, summary report of financial condition is the first of what will become an annual report that I issue to the selectmen, finance committee, and the community to kick off the annual budget process. It's one of a series of reports. The second is a community comparison report that looks more at the expense side of the ledger. That was also issued. I believe everyone has a copy of that here tonight as well. So, the intent of both of those reports and the summary report of financial condition is to just kind of pull together helpful and important financial health metrics for people who are in policy and financial decision-making positions to look at and to consider as they proceed through the annual budget cycle. So basically it's meant to provide helpful context to the broader budget cycle. This is a report that my office used to issue years ago. We haven't done so in a few years, so it was part of my goals with the selectmen this year to bring this and some other reports back. So this is being issued as part of a fiscal 20 budget process. It is a fiscal 18 report. However, that is the most recently closed financial year. That's what this report looks at. It provides analysis of some key areas: revenue, our tax levy, state aid, local receipts, reserves, debt per capita, pension liability, and for the first time this report also quantifies and discusses OPEB, which is an acronym from other post-employment benefits. In the municipal context, that is retiree health care largely, and looks at where Easton ranks on some of those metrics. So there's a kind of report history, an interim period of this that goes through where the town has been financially in the past 3 years. I don't think, if you'd like, we can go through that, but I don't know if that's necessary. I do know, obviously, there's been a lot of changeover on the committee. I'm happy to flip through it.
You guys, I mean, I've been here for the last 3 years anyway, so would you guys like him to cover some basics?
Yeah, basics would be.
Sure. So the last time this report was issued was looking at, I believe, the end of year fiscal year 2015. That report was issued in April 2016. It concluded cautioning that the town has to be careful to balance the operating and capital needs that we have with the needs to maintain financial discipline, and further that balancing each successive budget since the recession would get increasingly difficult and that we would have to continue to brace for the impact of stagnating revenues. As we know, that has borne out to be the case. A lot of major milestones happened since April 2016 in Easton. Those include Selectmen, Finance Committee, and School Committee recommending a Prop 2.5 override to town meeting in May of 16. Town meeting voted to approve that contingent budget, but that override itself was rejected at the polls in June of 2016.
There is a correction on that. The Finance Committee did not recommend 4.3 million.
It was an amended amount, I believe.
3.7.
I'll make note of that, thank you. That override was ultimately unsuccessful at the polls. That summer, the selectmen adopted a series of financial management guidelines, formalizing some best practices for the town, and establishing some guidelines for the ongoing use of free cash and stabilization funds in our operating budget. The selectmen awarded a contract to the Abrahams Group to perform an operational audit of the town and schools in September of 16. In May of 17, town meeting adopted the fiscal 18 budget, which partially implemented those guidelines as they pertain to reserve fund use. In November of 17, town meeting appropriated $600,000 to the stabilization fund, again in accordance with those guidelines. In May of 18, town meeting adopted the fiscal 19 budget, which fully implemented those guidelines as it pertains to reserve fund use. That budget used no stabilization fund dollars for the first time in 5 years. It cut reserve fund use to a 5-year low. And during that budget process, we obviously had some pretty involved conversations about things like having to do a shared school resource officer program. And the schools went through the privatization of special ed van services to try to live within those revenue means. A few months ago in October, town meeting appropriated again a quarter of our free cash, which was over $500,000 to the stabilization fund, which brought it to over $2.7 million, which is the highest that the stabilization fund has been in a decade. So a lot of ground has been covered in the past few years, which brings us to today. So the town of Easton has revenue challenges. That's something we've talked about quite a bit. We talked about it as committee quite a bit. But despite that, we finished fiscal 18 in the black. We had a certified free cash just over $2 million, which is healthy, but it is notably below the past 2 years. 2 years prior, we were at nearly 2.7, then to 2.4, and now down to 2 million. The past decade, we've been looking at free cash generally in the area of 1.5 to 2.5 million. So 2 million in and of itself is not some sort of red flag or cause for concern, but it is, I believe, indicative of tightening margins on our revenue forecasts as well as what our expenses are. Taxation and new growth. We were fortunate. Fiscal 18, we projected new growth to come in at $700,000. It was actually certified at just over 1 million, which is the highest new growth we've had in many, many years. A lot of that was attributable to the Avalon project. That was 418,000 of that over 1 million in taxable growth. With that, our tax levy stood in excess of $54 million. State aid is our another revenue category this report looks at. It's our second largest revenue category, but it has become a smaller piece of a revenue pie year over year. And there's a table you have. All the tables are contained in the back of this report, starting on page 14. And you can see that state aid in fiscal 18 represented about 17% of our revenue, which is down from a year prior and down meaningfully from about 23% of our revenue before the recession. There's more detail on table 5, which illustrates the cuts to state aid to Easton that occurred during the recession years. Starting in fiscal year 2009, the year prior, state aid peaked at 11.9 million, and after some cuts through those recession years, and then very slow growth after, it took 8 years. So it took between fiscal 8 and 16 for that aid to recover, not adjusted for inflation or any kind of growth metric, just in real dollars. So it's basically, we had a $100,000 increase in state aid over the course of 8 years. Just for a frame of reference, if state aid kept pace with inflation during that same time period, it would have been 13.7 million in fiscal 16 rather than 12,060,000. Insufficient growth in state aid has challenged our revenue side of the ledger. It is worth noting that there were layoffs during the recession years. Those were mitigated by leaning on the stabilization fund. The stabilization fund itself had been built up during the last override the town had in 2006. Local receipts is another of our revenue categories, performed well in the last few years. You'll see in my budget presentation as well that for years this has been a kind of a bright spot in our revenue picture. Local receipts are things like ambulance fees, meals tax, excise tax, and they've been growing at a higher percentage rate than our taxation or our state revenue, but we're beginning to see that start to level off. Collections peaked in 17 and declined going into 18. Again, that's somewhat attributable to the Avalon project. There was significant building permit revenue collected during that year, which obviously does not reoccur every single year. That's where we see that. We have and will continue to be very conservative in estimating our local receipts because it's important for us not to overshoot those estimations and end up in a situation where our collections are under that and damages our free cash generation. Already spoke to free cash a bit. Talk about the reserve position of the town. Reserve position is basically just a ratio of what our free cash and stabilization funds on hand are as a percentage of our operating revenue, our operating costs, sorry. It's the goal of the town to work towards 10%. That has not been the case. As far back as I can recollect, it was not the case when we adopted that fund balance policy. That's an aspirational goal, and we've been working towards that. Between 17 and 18, our reserve position dropped by, I think, 1/100%. We went from 5.62% to 5.61%. That's largely driven because one of the two pieces of that reserve balance is your free cash, and free cash in fiscal 18 was $400,000 less than in 18. Nonetheless, we have been building in the right direction. Don't have the number in this report, but I believe the last time we did a summary report of financial condition, the reserve fund ratio was closer in the 4s, so we have been moving in the right direction. We have, obviously, in light of that concerning reserve position, been prioritizing rebuilding our stabilization fund. I touched on that briefly in the summary of what we've done in the past few years. We've added over $1 million to that stabilization account in fiscal 18 and 19 to reach a 10-year high mark, and we've been working very diligently with the schools to keep expense budgets as lean as possible so that we can continue to reduce our reserve fund use in each successive budget. So those are all kind of annually recurring revenue concerns. We also, in this report, highlight longer-term financial considerations like debt, pension liability, and OPEB liabilities. The town of Easton had its bond rating of AA3 reaffirmed recently. The ratings agency, as previously cited, our adoption of best practices in conservative financial management as some of our strengths, along with the town's general economic strength. Our pensions are managed by the Bristol County Retirement System, so Easton is a municipal employer. Our employees have a defined benefit pension retirement plan. Easton is one of many other communities that are part of a county retirement system. The latest data available shows a funded ratio of that retirement system at 67.7%, with it on track to be funded fully by 2028, which sounds far away, but is really not. We're talking about the fiscal 20 budget here. Talking a little bit about OPEB. So other post-employment benefits is an area that is a huge challenge for all municipalities in the Commonwealth itself. It's something that folks in this industry talk a lot about. We have our actuarial liability for other post-employment benefits audited, and what that represents is, first of all, a very large number. It's over $110 million. But that is not an obligation that the town has to fund or meet in one given year. That is indicative of future retiree obligations. The town does, and will continue to fund its retiree healthcare obligations each year in our operating budget, which you can see specifically called out as retiree healthcare in our operating budget. However, being cognizant of and building towards having funds on hand to support those future liabilities is important, because as time goes on, healthcare costs generally go in one direction, which is up. More people retire. People who retire are then replaced by an active employee. So if somebody retires with health insurance and is replaced by a new employee who then takes health insurance, you now have two plans. So the cost of retiree healthcare as a portion of our healthcare spending grows each year. So the town established a OPEB trust fund in 2013 and put a nominal amount, $50,000 in it. There's currently $113,000 in it. That is obviously a fraction of that long-term liability. And it's a challenge to, especially in a situation where you have a structural revenue deficit and are relying on reserves to fund your year-over-year obligations, to take money and set it aside. But that doesn't really change the fact that it's a challenge we need to meet. We, this year, took, I think, an important step towards that. Out of the 5 townside unions that have ratified contracts for this 3-year period, all of them agreed to a policy framework that would see employee contributions to that trust fund once all labor groups agreed to do so. Obviously, you would want that to be equitable. You wouldn't want a bargaining unit of 20 people contributing to a trust fund for 800 employees until everyone is doing it. But so far, every town union has agreed to that. That's meaningful, and that's they deserve a lot of credit for coming to the table and working with us on that. So I want to be clear. I'm not saying we fixed it, no worries, there's money going in today. There's not, but we've established a policy framework, which is a major first step, and it was done collaboratively with our labor group, so we appreciate that. So again, I apologize if it was kind of just reading through the report. I know that wasn't the most captivating manner of touching on this data. And a lot of this is somewhat contained in the budget, so at a risk of repeating myself, I'll save some of it for that.
Thank you, Connor. Thank you very
Thank
much
you.
for doing that. I will ask a question, as you just hit on the OPEB funding. So last year when we had met, there was still one contract that was outstanding. Has that now been resolved? Is everybody now on board and in agreement that this would happen?
For
Collective bargaining.
The
one, well, there are 3 town contracts still outstanding that are still being worked on.
Okay.
In which I can't comment on the details of those.
Sure, of course.
But the 5 that are ratified, all 5 have agreed to that language.
Very good. Well, thank you very much. I know, I think this is a nice report and a summary for all of us to springboard from. I don't know whether or not we need to accept the report as presented. I don't think that was an actionable item, but thank you, Connor, for doing that and for presenting it again. You went through it as if you've done it a few times now in your sleep. And I don't mean that it was boring. I mean,
sure. I didn't know how to
It's just-
respond to that.
No.
I hope it doesn't
mean
put
that
anyone else to
it was,
sleep.
Very well covered in a short period of time, so we appreciate that and thank you, because now to move on to our next agenda item with you, and that is about introducing the budget for 2020. And so, if without any further ado, questions for the committee. Anybody? Good.
Just need one moment to get this.
Sure thing.
So while this loads up again, maybe if anything that I just kind of tore through quickly is repeated in here. Trying to have as much connectivity between all of these presentations and the budget as possible, but sometimes I might repeat myself.
Sometimes driving a point home is important.
That's okay. All right. probably should have done this first. For anyone watching at home, my name is Connor Reed. I'm the town administrator. Thank you to the Finance Committee for having me. I'm happy to present my preliminary fiscal 2020 budget. By way of background, tonight is the first of many nights that we and other stakeholders will be reviewing the proposed 2020 budget for the town. This is the first cut of a budget based on preliminary information, and it will be refined as the process unfolds. The process is illustrated on the screen above me. You could see through the kind of fiscal 20 preliminary process, we're sort of at the tail end of that as of this Monday with its issuance. From here through spring, I'll be working with department heads to continuously refine their expense budgets, update our revenue forecast based on collections to date, and we will be meeting through the warrant review process as well as in a joint hearing process with the selectmen and each of the department heads to review all of their proposed operating budgets for the coming year. Something new to the budget process this year, everything up there in green is a public process or presentation. The budget subcommittee has been working for its past few meetings to pull together a sort of state of the town report. The soft target right now is to have that report from a budget subcommittee presented to the Selectmen and Finance Committee the first of the 2 budget hearings, and kind of give a broad overview, pulling salient points from these kind of white papers I've put forward, the summary report of financial condition, the community expenditure comparison reports, as well as some other important things like where our capital assets management plan is, what our opportunities are there, what our challenges are. So that will be another addition and I think an improvement to already a relatively robust budget process that leads ultimately every year to town meeting in May, where the superintendent and I will present our operating budgets to town meeting and seek adoption. And so a broad overview of the budget. Everyone has a hard copy of it in front of you. At the end of that, you have a budget summary of revenue and expenditures, those same 3 pages you receive every year. And you all should have received it electronically yesterday. So just a broad overview, fiscal year 2020 is going to be a challenging year for the town. I probably start every year with that same introduction, and that's because it is true. The structural revenue deficit born out of the last recession persists, continues to constrain our ability to deliver quality services. Historically positive growth revenues, such as local receipts, have slowed down in recent years, as I just noted. And state aid continues to remain nearly flat, which is an incredible challenge for us. Reserve fund use of a budget, as it currently stands, is projected to be in accordance with our guidelines and will again represent another significant cut in reserve use, which is a good thing from a fiscal health standpoint, but also reduces funds available for appropriation for our expenditures. Preliminary departmental budgets on the town side fund only level services of what we have today with limited exception, and expense growth from a preliminary budget is driven mainly by fixed costs. Our preliminary expenditure projections are just over 87 million. That exceeds our projected revenues of just over 85 million and leaves us with a projected preliminary deficit of $1.9 million. So some background, we always go through the budget revenue side first. That is because we are largely constrained by revenue, so that is the first part of how we look at this. Cities and towns in Massachusetts are limited in their ability to increase property tax levy to 2.5% plus new growth each year. Easton has and will continue to levy property taxes to the extent allowed by Prop 2.5. And we've worked diligently to promote new growth in recent years to increase that tax base over the years. In addition to taxation, Easton obtains revenue from local receipts, state aid, and a combination of other funding sources. This presentation will flip through each of those sources in detail, highlighting the challenges that we have in front of us. First and foremost, preliminary 2020 budget projects an increase in total taxation of 3.62%, which is about a $2 million increase, bringing our tax levy to $58,626,312. It's our largest source of revenue for the town. It continues to grow as a portion of our revenue with each passing year. The table above me illustrates that. You could see slowly through each successive year that the percentage of our total revenue that is comprised of taxation increases. We're just shy of 73% at this point. This is a troubling trend because it obviously increases our reliance on one revenue type, as well as reserves to fund an increasing portion of our budget to deliver level services. And as time passes, this reliance only increases, which places a premium on our ability to incentivize new growth. New growth is a critical component of municipal revenue because it provides an additional source of funds by expanding our tax base. It represents the value of new or significantly improved property, which is subject to taxation, expansion of infrastructure, adoption of improved zoning, implementation of streamlined permitting. Those are all things that we have done. Those are all things that are intended to incentivize new growth. Obviously, broader market trends also significantly influence new growth. As you can see, the historical new growth chart above me tracks pretty neatly with the Great Recession and recovery that followed it. As I mentioned in a previous report, new growth hit a peak in fiscal year 2018, coming in at over $1 million for the first time since 2007. In fiscal year 2019, we projected a more conservative assumption of $700,000. That was certified at $865,000, which is good. It exceeded our expectation. And for now, at this early stage, because we try to be as conservative in our revenue projections as possible, we are assuming a new growth of $700,000 in fiscal year 2020 because that tracks, with the exception of the Avalon anomaly in 18, with the past 5 years. Local receipts. Local receipts are composed of things like motor vehicle excise tax, ambulance fees, local meals taxes, permits, things of that nature. As I just mentioned, in recent years, I've highlighted this revenue category as a relative bright spot in our revenue picture. We've anticipated that this would eventually slow its growth. In between 17 and 18, it did decline, in large part, as I mentioned, due to the falling off of certain one-time building permits for large projects like Avalon. We're typically conservative in our revenue projections at this date, and we're going to continue to look at this and refine it through the process because, again, it is very important for us to have those conservative revenue estimations because our free cash generation is so important due to our reliance on it in the budget. The preliminary 2020 budget is projecting a modest increase of $143,000, which is 2%, for a total local receipt projection of $7.3 million in fiscal 20. State aid. State aid is the second largest source of revenue for the town of Easton. It is a vitally important component of our ability to deliver services to the public. It is also one of the most significant and persistent challenges on the revenue side of the ledger for us, seeing that it has had very marginal growth since its cuts in the recession era. As the graph above me illustrates, state aid reached a peak in fiscal year 2008, which it declined, with the exception of 10, until 2011. It took until fiscal 16 to recover. The current budget, the preliminary 2020 budget for the town of Easton, projects a marginal increase of state aid of only $167,000. That's 1.3%, for a total of $12.9 million, and that's based on Governor Baker's 2020 budget. That will be refined as the state's budget goes through its own concurrent budget process. We've already contacted our legislative delegation advocating for adequate funding. We'll keep a close eye on it and refine that as that goes through that process. However, that marginal increase in state aid is entirely eliminated by increases in state assessments to the town. So the town receives revenue from the state, but we also pay assessments to the Commonwealth. And in the preliminary 2020 budget, we are looking at an increase in assessments to the state of over $300,000. Again, our revenue is increasing by about 170, and our assessments are increasing by almost 200,000 above that. This increase is primarily due to a significant jump in our charter school assessment of $300,000. And the result is a net decrease of state revenue to Easton of $192,000. So again, the second largest source of revenue to the town, having a net decrease presents significant challenges, and it is not sustainable. The table above demonstrates state aid as a percentage of our general fund revenue, same table as we just showed for taxation. Same idea, opposite trend. You see state aid becoming a smaller and smaller percentage of our revenue with each successive year, down to 16% in fiscal 20, which again is an appreciable decrease from approximately 23% of our revenue before the recession. Reserve fund use. So as we've talked about many, many times here, the town has a structural revenue deficit that was born out of the last recession, and since that time and the subsequent stagnation of the state revenue to the town, we have been using reserve funds, both free cash and stabilization funds, to close that revenue deficit each year at an unsustainable rate. 3 years ago, the Board of Selectmen adopted a series of financial management guidelines that incorporated a lot of great practices, but also significantly laid out some parameters on what the expectations were as far as the use of free cash or stabilization funds in our budget. Most significantly for the budgeting process, no more than 50% of free cash being used towards the operating budget, which again is why that decline in free cash certification each year, it has a significant impact in future operating budgets. As well as a guideline that we should be transferring at least a quarter of that free cash into our stabilization fund, which we've been doing. I show this graph every year when we look at the budget. It illustrates what a structural revenue deficit looks like. It displays, it's a stacked chart showing our reserve fund use in each respective year. So in red, you have free cash use. Blue is stabilization fund use. This goes back 13 years. Because that is the last year we did not use an appreciable amount of reserves in the budget, which was the last year that there was an override. Shortly after that, you can see the effects of a recession where we received cuts to revenue in the town from the state in fiscal year 2009, and that began a trend of using $1 million or more in reserve funds every year to balance each successive budget. That practice hit a peak in fiscal year 2016 with just over $2 million in free cash and stabilization funds being used in the operating budget. This is not a practice. It's not a recommended practice. This is one that has been born out of necessity in the town. This is not indicative of large expansions to services or staff or programs. This is largely representative of level service. Nonetheless, it doesn't change the reality that we need to do everything that we can in the interim to try to reduce our reliance on these reserve funds. And you can see that in this graph. After peaking in 2016, with those policies being adopted, we, in the current fiscal year, 2019, fully implemented those policies and use no stabilization funds in the budget. And the free cash use was down to 1.2 million, which is a cut of about 800,000 from 16. As it currently stands, the fiscal 2020 preliminary budget is projecting continued adherence to those guidelines. It's just over $1 million in free cash. That would be the lowest use of reserves in over a decade, and it would represent a reduction in our reserve use of over $1 million since fiscal 16. That's an important an admirable goal to strive towards. However, when you look at it in the context of our total revenue, we're talking about net decreases in state aid in some years and also cutting a reserve, a revenue category by nearly $1 million in 4 years. So it really does challenge us on the expense side of the budget. For now, that is the plan. Any change to this would be a last resort. Moving into the expense side of the ledger, it's important to talk about the challenges we have on the revenue side. We also have to do what we can to try to mitigate our challenges on the expense side and live within our means. We have been pretty aggressive in that area. We've succeeded in reducing expenditures in health insurance. We switched to the GIC a few years ago. That saved over $300,000 in that year, and resulted in an average increase of our premiums since joining of about 1%, which is quite good. That it significantly outperforms the smaller regional health group that we were getting insurance through at that time. And given the size of employee and retiree healthcare in our budget, having 1% increases is quite good. Last year, the actual increase was, I think, 1.01%, which is very helpful for us given our revenue challenges. We have aggressively pursued energy savings. We have worked to curb wage growth through the adoption of different wage plans. So you have non-union, professional administrative group, clerical union moved from growth patterns of 40% over 10 years to 30% over 15 years. That is significant. The current round of collective bargaining contracts thus far ratified on the town side are, in general, lower base wage increase package than in prior years. 4 of those unions took a 0 base wage increase in the current year. Again, that represents a lot of work with our labor groups and is very important for the town's financial health, so they deserve recognition for that. Despite some of those successes, we nonetheless still have challenges because our total expenditures are continuing to rise at rates that outpace our marginal revenue growth. Town departments were instructed to submit level service budgets. And what you see in the summary is representative of contractual increases of the existing services. And we're looking at an increase of $561,000, which is just over 3%, to bring total town spending for police, fire, DPW, town government, library contribution to $17.5 million in fiscal '20. The Easton School Department, the number in the preliminary budget is a placeholder. That is not a number from the schools. The schools have their own concurrent budget process that happens and unfolds at the same time as ours. They're working through their first budget assessment to the town. So we went with a 4% placeholder for now. Funds available for appropriation are largely limited due to increasing fixed costs. So fixed costs is an important area of the budget to touch on. Fixed costs are costs which are generally difficult to contain, and we have limited to no immediate control over them in a specific fiscal year. They include things like debt obligations, employee health insurance rates, which are not set by the town, workers' compensation and property and liability insurance rates, which are set by our insurers, snow and ice deficits, $200,000 deficit being projected for now. Hopefully that does not bear out to be true, where the snow and ice budget is actually doing well right now. Dave Field is upset with me for saying that, because usually as soon as we do, we get Nemo'd and are under 3 feet of snow for 2 months. So that budget is performing well currently. Obviously, it is largely weather contingent. So if things continue at the rate they're going, hopefully we will not have any snow and ice deficit there. Retirement pension assessment is significant, as I alluded to before. The town of Easton is part of a county or retirement pension group. That pension group is on track to fully fund its obligations by 2028. Employees pay a contribution depending on when they were hired to that. And the newer you are, the more recently in the past you were hired, the larger percentage of contribution you contribute. I think right now the current rate is 9% of your wage plus 2% on anything over $30,000. That did not used to be the case many, many, many years ago. So the pension systems have assessments for the employer to build towards that full funding. So that is projecting to increase by 8% going into next year. That's pretty common. That is what we've been seeing for the past few years. And that it's also taking into account, you can, as an employer, receive an early payment discount if you pay the assessment up front. We do pay that assessment up front every year to save that money. And nonetheless, it is a large increase. Regional school assessment, we're currently, that's a placeholder as well, much like with Easton Public Schools. We have a concurrent budget process that unfolds alongside ours. The past few years, we have seen significant increases, double-digit percentages, largely driven by increased enrollment of Easton students at the regional school. For now, that 15% is a placeholder, and we will refine that as the schools work through their budget process. And just to provide a little bit more detail here, so debt service, we're looking at an increase of 12%. That is largely representative of the energy services contract annual payment that was in the school operating budget is being put in the debt budget because that is a more appropriate line item for it. It is a debt payment, as well as some premium pay downs on general borrowing for sewer capacity treatment associated with the Five Corners and Queeset projects that were authorized in, I believe, 2015. It's 2020's debt service budget is still well within the threshold. We try to keep it between 5 and 7% of the town's expenditures, and is beneath the fiscal 18 debt service budget. Nonetheless, it's a significant increase year over year. The good news is that those paydowns are we have some of that coming off the books, and so going into next year, 242,000 of that will come off the books. Employee health insurance, that is a 5% placeholder that is expected to come down. And we have recently been informed by the GIC, that's a group insurance commission through which we procure insurance for our employees, that the aggregate rate increase expected for 2020 is 3.3%, not 5%. However, they don't have per plan rates. They offer many different plans. And we are waiting to receive those towards the end of February. We'll get those exact rates per plan, and we will plug that in, obviously, with the exact enrollment of all of Easton's employees and get an exact number for that budget. So we do expect that to come down. Workers' comp and property liability are also large increases. Those are preliminary. Our workers' comp is based on payroll actuals in the year prior, and the liability insurance increase is largely tied to revaluation of our property values by our insurer that they do on a cyclical basis. But again, we expect that to be refined. And as I already mentioned, snow and ice hopefully will be 0. So in summary, as I mentioned in the opening of this presentation, our preliminary revenue projections are just over And for now, as I mentioned before, the projected 2020 budget adheres to those guidelines that we implemented fully last year on the use of reserve funds. That's an important goal for the town. But obviously, cutting our reserve use by $1 million in 4 years creates some challenges. On the expense side, the final numbers for health insurance are not in yet. Some of those fixed cost numbers are expected to be refined. Departmental budgets are going to be refined. Something I didn't put a bullet point on here, but that I would like to note is that there is still a small collective bargaining reserve that you'll see in the employee benefits line. That's because, as I had mentioned, not all ratified. We're working on the other 3. And we are currently going through a wage classification program for the non-union employees. That's a small group of less than 20 employees. The personnel bylaw requires that the Human Resources Board and the town no less often than every 5 years do a salary survey based on the market and internal equity and make any adjustments necessary. So we have set a small amount of funds aside in that reserve in the event that there are any adjustments needed. I look forward to working with you, school committee, selectmen, everyone else to bring a balanced budget to town meeting in May. And I'd be happy to answer any questions.
I have a question. Does this projection of the 1.9 million every year, so I'm not overly concerned, though I'm sure I'll read it in the paper. Does it include level services? I know you can't speak for the schools.
With, as I said, limited exception, right now, the preliminary does have a 38th officer. We are continuing to try to have the goal of 2 school resource officers. Right now we have 1, and we share it. That is in the budget now. I can't commit, obviously, to that remaining there due to the size of the deficit, but that's a major priority for
That's
the
one
chief.
individual.
That is it. Other than that,
And you can't speak for the schools, though.
I cannot. Other than that, there may be tweaks on the margins with some expense items, but as far as any kind of significant staffing changes, no, there's none planned. I did ask the department heads, particularly those of the larger departments with critical ongoing needs that we're just simply not able to fund. This is something we've talked about together at finance committee meetings. Oftentimes, by the time this preliminary budget is even issued, it has already been, the expenses have already been reduced. And there's no necessarily right way to do it, but rather than have positions that are needed be put through our accounting software that we know we just do not have the funds for this year, I did ask some of the larger departments to submit side letters that qualify and quantify what those needs are. Some examples of things we've talked a lot about, like in DPW, we do not have a plumber. We have $80 million in building
That was my question.
repairs,
the
which are
DPW.
backlog, and our buildings and grounds crew is 5 people, and that's buildings and grounds. So the lack of funding for a position in budget does not, as you know, equate to a lack of need or merit. So I wanted to make sure that we captured, and we'll talk more about that at the departmental budget reviews, and we'll work it into kind of a budget message and the narratives that each department has. We wanted to make sure that we start capturing year over year. By the way, these are needs that we know we have, that if we were being strategic, we would fund, but we understand our revenue realities. So we're not putting it in the accounting request, but nonetheless, we want to make sure that people remain informed that those needs exist. So you'll see some of that from police, fire, and DPW this year in their budget reviews. So, but other than that, level service.
Anybody have any questions?
Just on police, I met with the chief prior to
Sure.
the meeting, and the only one other thing that I think stood out was a maintenance budget now for the police department. It's kind of coming out of underneath the fire
Sure.
department.
Yep. So again, that's one of those expense things that are being tweaked. That full disclosure, I'm going to lean on the chiefs and Dave Field to speak more specifically to. But the general rationale there is that there are certain ongoing, smaller maintenance and repairs that any building would need. It had been somewhat centralized through DPW, as I just mentioned, they have a very small buildings and ground staff. So even small repairs would have to go through a separate office rather than the chief saying, okay, my toilet's broken, I need the toilet to be replaced. I'm going to have someone fix my toilet. It would have to go through an additional administrative process. So I believe that moving those expense items was more intended to give the people who are in those buildings the ability to address their needs. But I will ask the chiefs and Dave Field to speak more specifically to that.
Great, thank you.
Can I ask a question about the charter tuition reimbursement?
Sure.
Like, it's a significant, it's been up and down quite a bit over the last several
Right.
years, but it's a significant swing this year, matched by another significant swing on the veterans benefits. I was wondering if you could just speak to that a little bit, just so I could have a better understanding of why that's so.
Sure. So the charter tuition reimbursement, we end up having an assessment based on actual participation in charter schools. But we get an assessment early on in the process. You are correct, it has swung quite dramatically from the assessment, I'm just trying to pull it up, last year. Last year, the assessment was probably low.
4,000.
Well, that's for reimbursement on the flip side. But they go somewhat hand in hand. So the actuals are probably around 200,000. So that's one of the things we're going to be looking into, and we're going to contact the state and ask more about that, because we don't really know why it's that assessment is in the 300,000+ range. But it does vary every year. They have a reimbursement on the revenue side for it, but if you look, you'll see if you have a $300,000+ charter school assessment, the reimbursement, I believe, for that assessment is 74,000. So about a quarter more or less than what it actually costs.
Yeah,
so
the total net of state aid is still within a relatively standard status. It's not a dramatic shift on the overall net, but with that plus that shift in veterans, it's like
right. Okay, well, so we'll get to the veterans piece, but yes, the 1% increase is what we have typically seen. Unrestricted general government aid, that's the second category down.
Yep.
That's the second largest. That is going up 2.7%. That's the lowest amount that's gone up in many years. And Chapter 70, which is the most important component, is education. That's going up by less than 1%. So that's in keeping with what we've seen. The charter school swing is pretty significant, and like I said, we'll dig into that. And then the veterans benefits one is actually usually a positive thing. That is a part of Chapter 115. We have a veteran service officer who there are certain income and eligibility requirements for veterans in Easton to receive Chapter 115 benefits. That's a locally administered program where the town pays directly to veterans who qualify, and then the state reimburses us for 75% of those qualifying expenses. With the reorganization of health and community services and some sharing of services between kind of the more social services realm with our outreach coordinator and trying to pull in resources that are available from both nonprofits, state, and federal agencies, we've been able to connect veterans in Easton with more appropriate resources, and many folks are getting jobs and no longer need those. So that decline is largely representative of a decline in the town spending on those benefits. That's not, that decline is not to say that the VSO in that department are not supporting the veteran population. It's that the amount of folks eligible to receive that has declined.
Thank you.
Which is a good thing.
Anyone else? Okay. Well, Connor, once again, you've done a great job. Thank you very much. You have a lot of work to do. I don't envy you. Do you have anything else you'd like to add?
No, but I think I've taken enough of your time. I'm happy to answer any additional questions, and if anything comes up after, you could always contact me. I'm happy to get together. We need to book those joint budget hearings.
Yes.
I'll connect with the two of you, and we'll figure out what dates are best for that. We typically do late March or early April, so we'll target that.
Okay. Okay. Pencil it in. We'll figure it out. You're welcome to stick around. It's up to you. But what I'm going to do is just continue on into the next item on the agenda.
Go for it.
Budget and departmental review updates. We all got reports from Wendy. I believe it was Monday morning. Or she sent them out Friday. We got Monday morning. Did anybody have time to go over their budgets?
Yes.
All right. Patrick, why don't you take it away?
So we're sitting just past the halfway point, and both of my areas are at respectively library at 50 and planning at 61%, so nothing drastic, nothing looking like right on schedule, right on track.
Okay. And what departments were they?
Library and planning.
Library and planning. Okay. Berta?
I do borrowing, debt and interest, and employee benefits, and other. For the most part, has really touched on where we are in terms of all of these categories. Again, nothing remarkable in the budget reports as
My budgets, which are very simple, Board of Selectmen, Finance Committee, there's been no changes. It's right on track with the year where we are. Jennifer?
So I have DPW and nothing notable beyond the anticipated snow and ice summary report. So I'll give a quick update on the latest report, which I received today, following yesterday's event. So for the year, we are up to 11 snow and ice events. As I mentioned before, there's a mix of what they define as an event, from sanding, spotting, sanding spots, sanding mains, plowing, scraping, etc. So 11 events. Total cost so far $222,765 for the year, up from the total budget of $493,700. So we are, we have spent less than half of the budget, which is good, but knock on wood, it's still less than half it. The snow totals for the year have been almost 14 inches. The total cost per inch is around $16,000 right now. That will come down over time because that number includes a lot of fixed costs. Let's see here, what else is notable? Per the definition of the way the town defines the end of winter, which is March 31st, which we've had snowstorms in April, we're 61% of the way there. So the other interesting metric is that typical snow to date, we've had about 27 inches. This year, we are only at 13.8, so we're almost 13 inches below typical. So as of right now, the numbers are benefiting from a very slow start to winter. Maybe it's not going to be ever a major uptick, who knows? We have to review these cautiously and optimistically. And they are continuing the brining operations. There was a post yesterday on the town Facebook page about how they had put out, it was 14,000 gallons of brine before the storm that we just had. So, you know, and again, as mentioned previously, that cuts down on costs for snow operations because they do a lot of prep during regular hours, and it shifts the dynamic when Dave is planning for an event. So we'll have to see at the end of the year what the net impact of that was.
Thank you. Any questions for Jen? All right, Davis?
So I have the town accountant, town assessor, and town collector treasurer. I had the added benefit of meeting with the 3 department heads fairly recently, and they had their most up-to-date budget numbers. So town accountant and town assessor, both of their departments look, you know, nice and on track. Both are overwhelmingly salary, and then with a very small discretionary budget, which they both said is adequate and will get them through the end of the year. For collector treasurer, so Linda Hawks, the collector treasurer, she just took over, I think 2 years ago now, I want to say, maybe a little longer. And while there was an interim, a kind of backlog built of older cases that were in delinquency. And so she's found that she's had to spend more money than she thought on bringing in outside legal help in order to resolve a lot of those older cases. And so the good news is that those are basically, you know, one-time things. Once they're gone, because she's also keeping up with all the current cases. But she basically said that it's going to be tight, but she thinks she's going to just squeeze it through this year. And then depending on how much of the backlog gets cleared by the end of this budget year, either next year will be much more comfortable, or, you know, she may have another tight year if there's more, you know, more of the backlog to get cleared.
Is the spend on the legal counsel offsetting is there any revenues that are being collected as a result of that work that would offset that?
That's a good question. I do not know, but I can definitely ask. Would the revenues go directly to her, or would they go into the general town, like go into some other fund?
I think they would filter through, yeah.
Okay. She did say that she does have a small revolving fund that she can lean back on if her, you know, money gets closer to zero than she'd like. But yeah, I think that since the money goes to the general fund, she's still operating just within what she's
Right, so within her own budget.
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
She doesn't recognize it, but it still benefits the town in the large.
Sure.
Yeah. understood.
Yep, that's my 3.
Thank you.
Tim?
So I have schools, fortunately I didn't get a chance to meet with the department heads this month again. I do have emails off to both of them, hoping to do that before March, because the goal there, as you heard Connor say, they're diligently working through their end of year numbers as well, so they should have some wrapped up plans. What I can see running down, the schools are within 3% of where they should be for the big ticket items. Southeastern Realtek's right down the line, 50%, so everything's looking pretty good there. So hopefully by next month I'll be able to get a much clearer picture where we're going to end up landing for 2020 this year.
Jamie?
Yes, I had the opportunity to meet with both Chief Sullivan and Chief Partridge, and you kind of heard Connor mention the 2 things that came up. One was to +1 from 37 to 38 officers, and one being designated to as a resource officer full-time to Southeastern Regional School District. They did put together, and I haven't heard the results, and maybe that's one thing I could have asked Connor, but it sounded like he wanted to defer questions to the chiefs about a memorandum of understanding between Southeastern Regional and the superintendent, folks. And that was about, so basically they pull what the cost would be for that additional, that full-time resource officer. And they just laid out, they used the state memorandum for resource officers, so it's laid out well, provides a mission statement, what these officers are responsible for doing, and the benefits to having a school resource officer, building the trust within the student body, not just having a resource officer that shows up to put out a fire, and then it's just kind of a negative connotation all the time, versus one that's there, and is part of the student population, can really build a rapport with students on an ongoing basis. So that's one, and then the other one was, they had given me a number. They mentioned they've asked for $10,000 as a maintenance budget. Today, the police department only gets $900 a year. They want to bump it up to $10,000. Part of it was the roof on the police department, which is combined with the fire department, has been leaking. They've been chasing leaks, and the on the police side, they actually had to remove mold from one of the interior sections of the chief's office. So they've been kind of chasing this leak, and now it's leaking again this winter from ice and snow and the effects of that. So I think that'll have to get addressed between the DPW and the 2 chiefs. And
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like a capital expense to me, not operational.
Yeah, so I'll learn more.
Yep,
This is
yep.
my first look at it and getting an idea from them. What I'm showing is they've used through January 31st, or I should say remaining, for the police department is 45.41% of the budget. Dispatch, 42.58. Fire, 46.74, and ambulance, 38.79. Couple highlights from the fire department.
That seems low.
For remaining,
Yeah.
so I'll have to go back through and figure out why.
Yeah, because we got 4 months left before the fiscal year ends, and they have, upwards of 60% left in their budget. I mean, they often plan things that they know are going to hit at certain times of year, and it evens out at the end, but.
Yeah, and both did feel they were kind of in good shape at the time, didn't feel they were outside of it, but, seeing this is worth looking a little bit deeper. The fire department, they do have a request, if you look at, they did want to add, and I don't think this is going to happen, but a part-time clerical assistant for the secretary. So right now there's no backup to payroll for the current secretary, and they're also now kind of getting bogged down. We're running 2 full-time ambulances with a 3rd ready to go, and if we stood that up, we could probably bring in more revenue for the town versus what our spend is still pretty high with utilizing surrounding town ambulances. But although there's a 3rd-party billing company for the ambulance, we still have to prepare hospital face sheets, patient contact records, and there's run slips that need to be sent to the billing company, and if they're not on time, then we get dropped down. You could potentially not get reimbursed. So all that's very time critical and requires a lot of additional man hours. So
Mhm.
I kind of hearing where things are going, I think that's gonna be a tougher conversation.
Mhm.
And then some of the other things that jumped out were career incentive, sick coverage, training. These are some of the things bringing up the payroll subtotal, like the difference for fiscal year 20 or 20. Any questions?
That was very thorough. Thank you. Does anybody else does anybody have any questions for Jamie?
And there are, some of the other, there's software that they want to implement, new software for, I should have to go back some notes, but I can tell you from a cost standpoint, $13,000. Did a really good job kind of laying out what they're looking for, what they're going to ask for, and then.
Gee, they've done a lot of work on preparing their budget for 2020 already.
Correct, and this is going back.
I mean, we're in February. They have.
Day after the Super Bowl, yeah.
That's good on them that they're so
We're
far
the police
ahead.
department, and I met with them 2 weeks prior to that, so they admitted they were still kind of putting in
Mhm.
this level of, information provided, but yeah,
Yeah, they've done their homework for sure. Okay.
I'm going to circle back, excuse me, or.
I was just gonna say, I had points about David, but add about the grinding operations last time. But
Go ahead to you.
Okay, so quickly, last time, I was asked about the DPW and if they were considering selling the brine to other municipalities. Got an answer on that, as well as on the equipment that we have outfitted on the trucks here. I can read the response very quickly. The town has discussed this with other municipalities. Dave says, but I believe the transportation issue will be the limiting factor for other municipalities. East Bridgewater has discussed this with us, but they are in the very early stages of evaluating a brine operation. There are several municipalities in the greater Boston area that are sharing a mobile trailer-mounted brine maker, but each of those municipalities have much greater storage capabilities than we do. Either way, I don't think providing brine to other communities will be a significant revenue generator, as our current intermunicipal agreements allow us to recover our costs only when sharing resources. If we did end up supplying brine, I believe it would be temporary, only while the community evaluated the operation of themselves. We currently have 2 hook lift tanks that are used for direct liquid application with brine that can be loaded and unloaded as needed on 2 of our larger 6-wheel trucks. We are looking into the purchase of a 3rd tank for next year as well. So that answers the questions there are last time.
So I was following Patrick's lead, I thought we were just doing the quick, here we are in the budget, but.
I did too,
I'm gonna
but
turn this
everybody was
part
doing
of
so
their
great, so
report,
sure,
let me-
yeah,
let me bring you
absolutely.
a little bit further ahead on,
Okay.
progress that we have around the borrowing debt and interest topic in particular. Quick update for you, our town has no immediate needs for short-term borrowing and cash flow remains healthy despite property tax collections still having outstanding at this time with about 23% left to collect. That's important for our town to know, we've got good cash flow. There are other towns that need to go out into short-term debt to be able to keep up and catch up with their expenses that they're paying. Important for us to know and for the community to know that we have a healthy cash flow in this regard. So that's a kudos to the management and administration of that. In terms of our long-term debt, and this is a big area, this is a big one for us all to be aware of. I think on Monday night, the Board of Selectmen had a presentation about the district improvement financing plan. This is a big one that the Finance Committee needs to be aware of, that the town needs to be aware of. This will be a warrant article. This will be something that we will need to go to town meeting and to vote on. Mark and I had the good pleasure of meeting with Connor individually and with Wendy to hear and receive a presentation about the DIF plan, and the same presentation that the Board of Selectmen received on Monday night. I encourage y'all to look at it. The materials are available. They've been published. I'm pretty sure I sent them out to you in the form of an email. This is a substantial and significant debt that we would entertain and go into, but in support of and in promotion and furtherance of the Five Corners improvement, right? The plan that we have in place. So this is how we're going to finance that, and it takes a lot of interest, discussion, dialogue, public forum meetings, question inquiries from the public, the people who will be impacted by betterments that are being assigned to their properties and their own tax rates. Very important that we're aware of that. Stephanie Danielson has been invited to join us for our regular meeting in March, and she will have a dedicated presentation for us about the STIP plan. In advance of that, I encourage you to take a look at the materials, become familiar with the rationale behind it, what it means, and what the implications are for the town. We should be well versed in being able to come to the table on whether or not we, as a committee, recommend the article come time for town meeting. Any questions about that? Okay, certainly heard Connor mention about the unfunded pension and the unfunded OPEB liabilities. An interesting point is that the unfunded OPEB liability, a new accounting standard requires that that gets reported in the general fund and in the ledger and in our reporting. So that ties in also to the work on the audit committee and the financial audit that was done for 2018, in which we did hear that the auditors approved of and had done due diligence around that to make sure that we are compliant with that law. So that was also a very good update. You know, the thing on the pension and OPEB, Connor hit on it. Important for us again as a finance committee to realize that we continue to fulfill our obligations as a town to existing recipients of the benefits, whether employees who are, you know, OPEB benefits or pension. We are funded, we have not defaulted on any payments, regardless of the nature of the full funding of those accounts. It's important to know. And it's important to know that we have a plan in place to seek to ultimately get to that full funding, whether it's inside the county here and per Connor say, I think 2020.
2028.
2028.
Say that again?
2028.
2028. The Commonwealth, by contrast, not 2028, but 2036 before they're going to be fully funded for the pension. So we're in a good county, we're in a good place, and we've got a plan. I think that's newsworthy. And lastly, to Connor's credit, you know, they do use creative approaches to contract negotiation, to looking at other ways to, I think there was an incentive program for employees to consider purchasing a lesser expense health insurance plan, right? And you've got tiers of higher deductibles and lower deductibles, and you know we all look, right, as we purchase our own health insurance each year. There was an creative incentive program that Connor saved $40,000 with the team, just by virtue of employees electing a lesser cost insurance plan. These are creative ways that I don't think Connor brags sometimes often enough about the work that he does to really stretch the dollars that we have in the community. So even though Connor's not here, there is another round of applause that goes out in golf clubs for him. And if you don't mind, just from there, I'm going to jump over to my audit committee report because they all tie in together.
Absolutely.
Okay. We met on January 30th. The
We're at
audit.
a new agenda item, by the way.
Thank you for that. The audit committee met and received the report. Melanson Heath came in. Every year we do our financial audit to look at the status of the town finances. Mr. Scott McIntyre came and presented the report. Wendy and Connor, again, were congratulated for closing the books on a timely basis, which allowed the audit firm to meet the target reporting date of January. Last year, that was extended. It was prolonged primarily due to the actuarial report that had to be conducted, the actuarial analysis that had to be conducted by law. So we didn't have that this time. We were able to get to the audit report in a much more timely basis. In sum, the audit went very well, positive feedback, books and records are in good order, reconciliations are all done in a timely manner. The review did not require significant audit of entries. Routine assistance by the audit team was provided, as with reports presented by Connor, either in the state report that he just presented to us earlier tonight, or as I've reported under my department, budget updates, the OPEB liability credit, the OPEB liability is called out in the audit report. But positively, because of the transparency and the meeting and adherence to the regulatory standard. With a general fund of 2.9 million and a 2.2 million stabilization fund, this comes from the audit group, right? This is the external audit group reporting this, and these are his words. The $5.1 million general fund balance is pretty well balanced. I mean, these are the quotes that we use from the audit team. They also report that there is stability in the balance sheet, something that is a very positive comment for a town like ours, given the structural deficits and the challenges that we face. In sum, from the audit report for last year, there are no material weaknesses, and that's something that we can all be very, very proud of in the town. So we did consider as a last agenda item creating some additional objectivity in the annual financial audit, because we've used this team for many, many years now, over and over again. So whether we look at the advantage of recontracting, because we're up for a new contract with an audit firm, we do that for a 3-year basis. We have to look at whether or not there's an efficiency by going with the same team, right? They're familiar with us, they know our systems, they know who we are, versus bringing in a new team and having an objective set of eyes that are looking at us from a new perspective,
Right.
and finding things differently. So there's some trade-offs to that, right? One's going to take a lot more time and effort and education and work, whereas the other side, you got to think, how can we ensure that there is that objectivity and we don't get lax in our review? Not that I would expect that from any audit firm. However, we did talk about maybe switching up the principal that's assigned to the contractor, or something of that nature. So we are looking at ways to make sure that we've got that independence, that objectivity in the audit reporting for this coming year ahead. So,
Roberta, do you know, has that been done in the past 3 years where we've had a different principal assigned?
no, it's been the same principle.
Is there a cost difference to going with the significant added overhead that goes along with bringing in a new firm? Is there a cost increase?
No, because you would put it out and say, this is how much we
This is our bid.
this is what we would pay for our audits.
Got it.
And that's like 35 each year.
Not bad.
Any questions for Roberta? Thank you, Roberta. We'll go back to Patrick. School Planning Committee, you want to hit that?
Sure. We had a meeting on the 6th. We started to get some preliminary massing designs. So they're starting to actually sort of play with the spaces that are available on the multiple sites, putting up what the architecture sort of understanding of what the school buildings could potentially look like. Very, very early stage, not actually design standards, nothing where they're actually looking at it from a standpoint of like, this is what the perceived need would be, but more of we want to have natural light, so here's the east-facing windows, this is the way that the actual building would potentially be shaped, et cetera. Footprint, et cetera, yeah. So we got to see that to get a better feel, I think a much better feel for the various different site benefits.
Yeah, and we're almost three-dimensional, these renderings.
Yeah.
You gotta,
Is this for 4 sites or for 7?
4.
Four. We've cut down to 4.
Down to 4. Okay.
We're down to 4, yeah.
As of that meeting, we're essentially down to 3 at this point. Well, sorry, there's always going to be a renovation, no matter what. So renovation has to be included. And then the remainders are the other sites that are outstanding.
I think officially we're at 4, but you're right, it was leaning towards 3.
Submission,
We
by
talked
next
about
submission, it'll be
eliminating
3.
1, and I
Yeah.
think probably by our next one, we will be down to 3, but
So current status for that design option, which is early stage, this was actually an ongoing question that was asked quite a bit during the meeting, is that how locked in are we once we say, all right, this is what the building might look like, what's the look and feel, what's the actual sort of design elements for that building, where are we going to pull inspiration and engagement to make it not only be an aesthetically pleasing, engaging piece of property for the children of the town and the teachers of the town, but also to reflect how the town looks and the town's feel, things like that. So some of the context and history they're using to flesh out those different design options are things like the Shovel Works, the Ames Mansion, the library, the Oaks Ames, the Game Lodge, the Easton Historical Society, things like that that are very obviously classical architecture that speaks very, very highly of Easton, but also they're looking at the raw natural environment that exists within Easton, because they don't want to leave that out. There's a lot of green space incorporated into these various different design plans that are obviously attractive for a young student body. So things like Wheaton Farm, Borderland, et cetera, is also being taken into. They're doing a lot of preliminary investigation of those, which involves photography, existing photography, taking new site visits, things like that, to have an understanding of what they have to work with and what sort of that town feel might be if one of these sites is chosen and this goes forward. Let's see. Over the next few weeks, we're kind of looking at this now that they're looking at getting a little bit further in that massing design to get to roof form design, design examples. There was a conversation about recent schools that have been upgraded in this way, be it gut renovation changes, be it brand new school buildings built. They're investigating the opportunity of whether or not the school planning committee could potentially visit some of those sites and get a look and feel as to kind of current architectural trends for school buildings that are today, right? Current 2018, 2019.
That fit into
building.
our educational plan.
That are within that realm.
Yeah.
There's nothing that's obviously going to be one-to-one, but something that is for that early age range, for that early elementary stage. If we can engage with those upcoming school visits, perfect. There are no one-to-ones, obviously, because every site is very different based on existing site parameters, et cetera. So early age groups is going to be the initial thing to look for. We'll find out what we can find. And then the last piece is that the MSBA should be coming back this week. So we should have some responses this week from them based on their own timelines. There is a 10 working day response period after that is some additional engagement and additional discussion. And then the next community forum is going to be the week of the 25th of February. So we're going to have another community forum. You guys might have seen the flyers that have started to be produced and put out. That is going to be another opportunity for the town and interested parties to ask questions, to get engaged. One other small note on that is that I am investigating some other communication options that might be facilitating that type of engagement with some of the people on the planning committee to see what we can do about we have an existing website that is doing a lot of that basic work, like what amounts to be a frequently asked questions from the various different community members. Not everyone is as savvy as the average, let's say millennial that can get to a website in a half second. So what other features and functionality can we add to that to allow a little bit more of a communication pathway? And then one of the community members actually brought it up at the last meeting that there's still a need for a little bit more communication on that. So what other facilitation points can we do? Is that additional community forums? Is that presentations at various different library options? Things like that. So those are all investigations that are happening.
Do news reporters participate at all, or do we see that?
I've not seen them there. I think they must watch the video.
I think they watch the video. I think that's
and then
accurate.
they do reports after that.
There seems to be, I would say, there seems to be a bit more of the entertainment impact reporting of some of the findings that have been happening on some pieces. And then that's getting people in, which I think is actually a benefit. It's like, hey, big headline, here's what's happening, which then gets into the actual conversation. But there's been also criticism at these forums that people are not finding those. So if it's not something that's like a big, hey, headline, here's how much was asked for from a budget standpoint, which gets everyone's attention, even if that's not the final number, the more mundane sort of updates, be they weekly, monthly, et cetera, are relegated to later pages and sometimes missed. So that's been the feedback that we've been getting.
The only two things I'd like to add is on May 15th is the deadline for the single option for the school that is chosen. So on May 15th, we will know. The final cost of that school will be in September. So those are two time frames that people are probably very curious about. Also, there's a traffic study that began last week. It's taking 10 weeks. It's at Parkview and the whole school campus. They're going to review potential traffic patterns, impacts. I'm sure we've all been down there during drop-off or pickup, and it's not easy. So they're going to take a hard look at that. And we will have results and recommendations, I believe, in 10 weeks, up to 10 weeks.
Ongoing, they said. There'll be some information provided as they're going through, but the final report will be included in that full submission that we'll get in 10 weeks.
And you said April 25th or 24th is the next community forum?
February 25th.
Okay, because I was March 6th and April 11th, were those 2 dates as well?
March 6th and April 11th, I believe, are the subsequent, correct?
Okay,
Because March 6th is the one that we're putting out there because the final PSR has to be submitted by that, or no, I'm sorry, that's May. I think that's part of that secondary meeting that we're talking about
okay,
to do the update for subsequent community
Mhm.
feedback.
okay. So there's still opportunity for the community to provide feedback, provide input, and share what you think. So, any questions for Patrick? Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Mike and I are on the budget subcommittee, and Connor actually covered quite a bit of what we had covered in the last meeting, which was on February 4th. So just to give kind of a walkthrough of some highlights. We spent a lot of time hearing Connor's presentation, and then we're discussing the financial condition report. Something we talked about extensively that didn't get covered today, but that we actually all have is this community comparison report, which is actually really, really interesting. It looks at Easton compared to 8 core communities, so defined based on demographics and other aspects of the town that align most closely with us. And then in addition, there are 5 neighboring communities that don't fit those criteria necessarily, but neighbor us. So the report's trying to look at both the comparison along metrics that are closely related, but also our neighbors in proximity, how that might be, taken into account. I recommend taking some time looking through it. It's really interesting. It gets into the data of Shin's comparative analysis of how we compare in terms of budgets and towns and expenditures, all these different metrics that start to kind of give you a picture of what potential best practices or things might be able to draw from this. On the other side, you see a lot of elements that make us unique. For example, our commitment to conservation space in town. We have a large land area. This is something we had another table. I don't believe it's in this report. We spent a lot of time talking about this additional table that shows specific land area, overrides, things like this that starts to give this picture of how we're performing and how we fit in with our neighbors. And one of the big conclusions that came from looking at this was how much the town is doing with the resources it has in a very, very, very lean way. So I definitely recommend digging into this, and if we have questions, I'm sure Connor will come back, but it was very, very interesting. We also spent some time talking about...
Do you mind if I jump in on that, just because you're talking about that particular report? I think another bullet point that comes out of that report that's news and noteworthy is that our town's level of debt per capita relative to those benchmark communities and neighboring communities is on the lower end of the range consistently. So that's another, just I think a bullet point that's worth mentioning.
Yep, absolutely. In addition to this report, we spent some time talking about the 2020 budget forecast and the calendar, which Connor went into a bit on the process we have looking ahead. We talked about the town meeting, what to expect with the town meeting coming up in May 20th, and the presentation project that Connor had mentioned, where the committee will be presenting the first night of the 2 joint FinCom BOS meetings. So that was the bulk of it. I'd say we spent a huge amount of time on these 2 reports and really digging into them in detail. So if you have questions, or if you want to follow up Connor's presentation, it was February 4th, the budget subcommittee recording. The next meeting of that group is on March 4th, and we also have an additional tentative meeting that's possibly be added 2 weeks later, because there's going to be a lot of drilling down in details and preparation for presenting to that joint meeting. Thank you.
Davis?
So I am on the capital planning committee, and we had a meeting, I think it was on January 22nd, where we had IT, fire, police, and inspectional services present their requests. So in the order that the tabs are open on my browser, IT for fiscal year 20 has their standard request of about $33,000 to replace outdated computer equipment. They're basing it off of quotes that they used for fiscal year 2018, I think. And then that's basically just what they request every year. The only other additional thing is that in fiscal year 2021, they'll want to expand storage capacity and buy a couple new storage arrays for another $40,000. Other than that, they said that their requests are going to be basically the same as far as they can tell. For, let's see here, for the fire department, so their 4 big items were new defibrillators. I think it was 3 new defibrillators. They wanted to replace one of their utility vehicles, a 2008 Crown Victoria. They wanted to replace several of their nozzles, and they wanted 3 new thermal imaging cameras. That all comes out to about $170,000. I have the more specific breakdown. So it was 1 new defibrillator was $35,000. The new utility vehicle was going to be $50,000. All of the department's outdated nozzles are $52,000, and the 3 new thermal imaging cameras are $32,000.
How much was that last number?
The last one was $32,000 for the 3 thermal imaging cameras, and so that comes out to a grand total of about $170,000. What's up next? Inspectional.
David, say on the
Yes.
on the fire department, the defibrillators, was that a mandate? For some reason, I have something in my memory that says that was a mandate,
That's a good question.
an unfunded mandate.
I don't know off the top of my head, but that's definitely something that we'll be covering, I think, when we start to vote to, approve the capital budget requests.
Yeah, that should be considered as the approvals go through.
Okay. I'll make a note of that. For the inspectional services, Robert Alford, the assessor, actually brought this up when I met with him too. They're looking for a car, basically. $26,000 or $29,000, depending on which car.
We have a 2008 Crown Victoria.
Yeah, I think as of right now, the assessors basically, they drive their own cars all around town. I think Robert said that he bought a new car last year and he's put like 20,000 miles on it just from...
Does he get any compensation for that?
Reimbursed for that.
Yeah.
I think that they get,
Vehicle allowance or something?
I'm not sure, I think that they get some kind of like gas...
Stipend of sorts?
compensation.
I think they must get mileage.
They
Yeah.
just get IRS mileage.
I mean,
Yeah, at a minimum.
Probably,
I don't want to assume, but that's an
Sure.
important question
yeah,
60
yeah,
cents a mile.
because it is.
yeah. So I can clarify that with him, but he said that the use would basically be, not only does it, not have them using their own personal vehicles, but it allows them to keep all of their equipment in one place for when they're going around. It's like right now they have some arrangement where, I forget which department, but like one of the other departments lets them use one of their vehicles like Monday, Wednesday, Friday afternoons, and it's just, so that's on his wish list. And then the police department, their only thing for fiscal year 2020 is their kind of usual request for 3 new marked police vehicles. With the older vehicles, 3 older vehicles from the patrol fleet will be assigned to the school resource officer and or traded in at MHQ. So they just want 3 newer vehicles to replace the mileage on the older ones, basically. So that's the request we got.
Any questions for Davis?
I don't know if it's a question for Davis or for, just as a reminder from anybody who can tell me, the pavement budget, the pavement planning budget, where do we see that money?
DPW.
The money that they've been taking on debt for each year, the
Yeah.
$500,000
Yeah,
debt.
Is that a line item? I've not seen that.
well, that's what I'm kind of asking.
Yeah.
Where are we gonna see
I
that
believe
piece?
it's a debt, but
Just bundle into the overall debt expenditure.
Yeah, but I guess what I'm asking about it is what's being planned for next year? We know that we're tapping out on terms of the credit line
Yeah.
associated with.
okay, I'll check
fulfilling the
with
pavement
Dave and
plan.
find out what the plan is for this coming year. 'Cause I know that they were planning on doing another year, but I don't quote me on that.
Yeah, that's right, oh, great, my information,
On Monday night, Dave had his whole paving plan for the next 3 years. That's probably online, but you can check with Dave Field. It was pretty comprehensive. And it also indicates a problem with the amount of Chapter 90 funds that
Thank you,
the Commonwealth gives us.
thank you.
Yeah, the capital planning, we have yet to hear from DPW, and we have yet to hear from the schools are the two big ones, so those are gonna be coming up for us.
Thank you.
Tim? Jamie?
I think you did,
Kind of jumped to
you
the,
tapped in, right?
yeah.
You did pretty good.
Sorry.
All right. Does anybody have any questions, any follow-ups? All right, so we go right to review and approve minutes. January 18, our last meeting. Did everyone have a chance to review?
Yes.
Yes.
Anybody have any comments or corrections? Speak now or forever hold your peace. Anyone?
Anyone want to make a motion?
Anyone want to make a motion?
Make a motion to accept.
All those in favor? Second. All those in favor? Motion approved. Okay.
Thank you.
Stacy, have you been posting those?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Committee member comments. I think we covered everything. I have nothing left to say.
I think just a reminder about, considering scheduling for the next couple of months, really, as we jump really into this budget planning season
Mm-hmm.
and reviews and joint meetings with the Board of Selectmen. Has there been any talk at the BOS about scheduling the joints? Or is it just like Connor said, late March? Late March.
It's late March. What I would do, we'll go right to that agenda item. I would plan in March, we have our second meeting, second Wednesday in March, plan something at the end, and then in April, plan again the second Wednesday in April, in addition, at least another meeting, maybe even two, to go through every article, every budget. There's going to be a lot of work in the next 2 months. So at least 2 in April, at least 2 in March, at least 2 in April, possibly 3. Okay.
Any idea on the second March one? I know it'll be March 13th, is it happens to be the Wednesday, second.
Right. That's the one we were discussing with Connor, which would be the joint meeting.
So it would be on Monday then.
But there will be 2 joint meetings, right? Is that the potential plan?
Do you think a joint meeting in March and a joint meeting in April?
No, just a joint meeting in March.
Oh.
In April, the other boards that weren't presenting in the end of March will come in, or if we have questions, we want to get into specifics with other departments, they'll present.
And we walk through warrant articles too, as we get closer and closer to town meetings.
Okay.
What we'd like to do is go through the warrant articles, and then if it's a hot one, digest it, table it, think about it, and then come back and approve it. But some of them are very, very simple, and we just, we'll recommend or not recommend, and then just keep going through it. Okay. Community participation.
Thank you, Mr. Barger.
Thank you, Sarah.
I won't take much of your time. Craig Barger, Old Foundry Street. I just want to follow up a couple of comments by Patrick and regarding the school planning. I think it's critical to get the word out more than we have been getting it out. And I'm not criticizing, I'm just saying that we need to really make sure that the general public, our constituents, know what's going on, because I've been approached by a number of people, and I was just in conversation, and they were unaware that there was a school planning meeting, there was a school planning group. And I think it's really important, because when you start to engage, particularly parents, in the conversation, and they have kids in the school system, they're aware of some of the deficiencies in our buildings. And they're also aware that if we were to simply repair our 3 schools, you're talking $86 million.
In 12 years.
And we just don't have that kind of resource. And the opportunity to get funding from the state to bring our schools up to code today, for the future, is really important. So keeping that in mind, that we need to really make sure that people know what's going on a regular basis. A lot of people don't read the newspapers. They don't look at our website. So it's important for us as individuals to get that word out there.
Yeah, the school planning committee is sending out emails to the entire school body, so anyone that has children that are registered, they are getting emails whether or not they're actually paying attention to them based on I don't know how much communication the average parent has, since my kids are pre-kindergarten still. That's obviously one aspect. I would agree with you wholeheartedly, though, that a great example is there is a neighbor to the school who there will be some impact based on construction if a specific site is chosen, who was unaware of what the status was and then started coming to the meetings. And it's been a great addition to the meetings, is having that community participation like our friend Craig does every week. Having that type of additional engagement is huge, because you're right, having that knowledge ahead of time is going to be the significant thing that makes people understand exactly how much of a benefit it would be if we get a significant grant from the state.
I couldn't agree with you more, Craig. As Patrick just mentioned, people with children in the school system have been made aware of this because they get emails about these events. But outside of that, it's difficult to connect to people in forums, and they're not paying attention because it's not on their radar through no fault of their own. But I couldn't agree more, because it's a collaborative effort. It will affect everyone, whether you have kids or not. No matter where you are in this town, if you pay taxes, it's going to affect you. So what I don't want to see, and I think you don't want to see, or anybody wants to see, is at the last minute there be people speaking out saying, well, we didn't know, and it's, if anybody, even in our last school planning committee meeting, there was a member of the community there who we turned to and said, do you have suggestions on how we can get this out to people who aren't in the school system? Because the school planning committee, to anyone watching at home, if you have a suggestion, email, because we're open to suggestions. We do need to connect, and we're trying everywhere we can. But some people, it's just not on the radar. And we don't want to put out the idea that this is happening in the back room, where it's happening right out in the open. We need as many people
coming to the meetings,
participating as possible. So I couldn't agree more.
There's not a huge amount of obviously we allocated budget for this process, which is pretty well tightly connected to the process itself, right? The design firms, the architectural firms, etc. So we don't have a lot of expenditures that we can sort of variably float, like a mailing or things like that.
It has to be a free medium of sorts.
Exactly.
It was suggested at our last meeting by a community member, why don't you send a mailer out to the whole town? It's that we don't have the means to do that.
It's also not something, someone made a very, very key point, that because this is a community engagement process and there's nothing sort of written in stone as of yet, we're in that process. We allocated the funds, we're now investigating that process, et cetera. There's nothing that is a responsibility from the town to make people aware of that, which would flip the line between the school planning committee being able to sort of expense that based on the existing allocation, and then something that the town could say, well, this is a required, this is like 5 corners, we're digging up the road, we have to let people know that this is happening on such and such a date. Nothing like that exists as of yet, because we're still in the preliminary stages. But still, having that information out there now, like I said before, like the newspaper is having a value add, because it's like, hey, if there's a headline that's interesting that makes people understand.
It's a scary headline, but
scary headline might be.
It brings people in, and
but
once
hey,
you start reading it, you're like, oh.
Okay, not that scary. All right. There's some caveats and conditions here. Okay. But if there's something like just a general update, like, hey, the planning committee met, here's the status, and that's on page 7 of a paper that I don't know what the percentage of the town actually subscribes to. that's another diminishing return. So, great point.
Are there any lessons learned from like other communities who've been through the process recently? Stoughton,
That's a-
the high school.
That is a
That's
really
a
good
great
suggestion.
idea,
We should
yeah.
ask.
Yeah,
That has
I
not
feel
come
like
up.
Stoughton's high school project was so on my radar, and it's just like my parents don't have kids in the school or anything, but
Yeah.
it's a huge topic of conversation. So somehow word was getting out.
We should ask the architectural
That's
firm
a
how
great
they've managed that
point.
messaging in the past.
Due respect to our friends in Stoughton, they had a few crises, shall we say, I think that brought the public knowledge higher than would it normally. It might have been, but I'm not sure we want to do that. But the other thing
Oh, you know what not to do. So.
The other thing I wanted to just follow up with what Roberta was talking about, the diff and the Five Corners Sewer District. I think it's really critical that people become aware of what this means in terms of our ability to capture increased economic development in that area with that sewer district going in, and recognizing the cost, the betterment costs to the people who live there and the people who work there, that additional revenue potentially we could allocate towards reducing the betterment costs for people. And I think it's really important. It's also really important to stay aware of when we start the digging about the whole traffic plan, because Monday night we had a very extensive presentation of the traffic pattern plan, and it's significant. For those of us who travel on 106 or those of us who live on that side of Easton to be able to get to North Easton from there. So I think it's important for people to be aware of that as well. And there is a group, there's a community group that is very active and is very supportive. Obviously concerned about the betterment costs, but I think that's important because we've asked them to really get the word out as well. But it's important for the Finance Committee to do that as well. And I thank you for your time again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Craig. Great points.
That concludes our agenda and brings us to our last item. Anyone like to make a motion?
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
All those in favor? Thank you, everyone.
I have two from feedback kicks right when I put them back on.